Most people picture the Stone Age as a time of brutal survival and savage raids. Yet the real mystery is why large-scale wars almost never happened. The bones from Shanidar Cave and Sima de los Huesos show injuries, sometimes even murder, but sprawling battlefields and warrior classes are missing from the record. While later ages built walls and armies, early hunter-gatherers used mobility, cooperation, and shared toolkits to sidestep the logic of war. If violence was always possible, why did war so rarely erupt? Uncovering the truth behind why there were so few wars in the Stone Age will force us to rethink what really kept the peace and what changed forever. At Sima de los Huesos in northern Spain, archaeologists uncovered a single cranium with 2 clean fractures on the forehead, evidence of a deliberate blow delivered by another person nearly 430,000 years ago. Yet, among the more than 24 individuals found at the site, this is the only clear case of lethal violence. Most of the other skulls show signs of healed injuries, small depressions, splintered bone that later knit itself back together, reminders of encounters that left their mark, but not a fatal wound. Thousands of years later, and hundreds of miles away, Shanidar Cave in Iraq offers a similar story. Shanidar III, a Neanderthal male, suffered a puncture wound to the ribs, likely from a low-energy thrown spear. The injury was severe, but bone growth around the lesion shows he survived for months or years afterward. Another individual, Shanidar I, lived for decades with a crushed arm and head trauma, cared for by his group. These stories, written in bone, reveal violence as a fact of life, but not a constant threat. Injuries were often survived, and care for the wounded was common. Patterns like these suggest that in Stone Age societies, harm came in bursts, personal disputes, accidents, or rare attacks, rather than the relentless campaigns of organized war. At Terra Amata, on the ancient shores of the Mediterranean, early humans built shelters that would last only as long as the season allowed. Archaeologists have found traces of oval huts, some stretching 15 meters, their outlines marked by stone placements and hearths blackened by repeated use. Coprolite analysis reveals pollen from late spring and early summer, anchoring these occupations to brief windows when food and water were plentiful. No ditches, palisades, or walls break the sandy soil. Just open camps, exposed to wind and rain, but not to siege. Each year, the site was abandoned, its inhabitants moving on before resources ran thin or tensions with neighbors could grow. Hundreds of miles away, and tens of thousands of years later, the Mammoth-Bone dwellings at Mezhyrich rise from the Ukrainian steppe. Here, hunters assembled massive circles from the bones of at least 95 mammoths, roofed with hides, clustered around central hearths. The effort was immense, yet these structures too were seasonal, occupied for weeks or months, then left behind as herds migrated and the weather shifted. Across both sites, the absence of fortifications speaks louder than any wall. Mobility was the strongest defense. When disputes threatened, groups simply packed up and vanished into the landscape, leaving no target for attack, no territory to defend. In this architecture of movement, peace was built not from stone or bone, but from the freedom to leave. No blades gleamed in the hands of Stone Age hunters, no swords hung at their sides. The toolkit of the Upper Paleolithic was built for survival, not for battle. Wooden spears from Schöningen, carefully shaped and balanced, were optimized for hunting large game, horses, bison, deer, not for fighting other humans. Stone points, scrapers, and burins filled pouches and baskets, each tool serving many purposes: butchering meat, shaping hides, cutting plant fibers, or carving wood. Use where analysis reveals edge damage from slicing and scraping, not from combat. Even the most finely crafted points show traces of meat and plant residue, not blood from battlefields. In burial sites, prestige lay in beads, ochre, and personal ornaments, not in weapons set aside for warriors. There are no graves set apart by weaponry, no evidence of a warrior class. Status came from skill. Those who could shape the best blades, find the richest honey, or share the biggest kill. In these societies, reputation grew from generosity and knowledge, not from violence. The absence of dedicated weapons and warrior graves speaks to a world where tools were for living, and sharing built more honor than fighting ever could. At Jebel Sahaba, the Nile's ancient banks cradle a cemetery where the story of violence is written in bone. 41 out of 61 individuals show signs of trauma, projectile wounds, blunt force impacts, and cut marks that speak to a life shadowed by conflict. Among adults, nearly 3/4 bear these scars. Some wounds had healed, their edges smoothed by time and survival. Others were fresh, the final injuries before death. Children, too, were caught in these cycles. One grave holds a 5-year-old with multiple impact marks across the skull and femur. The cemetery's layout, with double and group burials, hints at repeated attacks rather than a single catastrophe. Climate records from this period reveal a landscape in flux. Arid pulses and unpredictable Nile floods forced rival groups to cluster along shrinking corridors of water and game. Each encounter left its mark, but the violence came in waves, raids, ambushes, moments of terror, then uneasy peace. A continent away in the Turkana Basin, the remains at Nataruk tell a different but equally stark story. 27 men, women, and children, some with hands possibly bound, were left unburied beside a vanished lagoon. 10 of the 12 best-preserved skeletons show evidence of violent death. Obsidian blades still lodged in skulls, crushed cheekbones, fractured hands raised in defense. This was no battlefield between armies, but an attack on a small encampment during a time when the land was lush, the lake high, and resources abundant. The trauma patterns, sharp force wounds to necks, embedded projectiles, blunt force impacts, suggest close quarters assault and no chance of escape. Both sites stand as rare exceptions amid the broader Stone Age pattern. Here, mobility and negotiation failed. Environmental pressure and competition compressed groups into conflict, leaving behind evidence not just of how people died, but of how they lived, returning, surviving, healing, and sometimes succumbing. The bones at Jebel Sahaba and Nataruk remind us that even in a world shaped by movement and dispersal, violence could erupt when choices narrowed and worlds collided. Blombos Cave, on the southern coast of Africa, holds some of the oldest evidence of symbolic behavior in human history. Roughly 75,000 years ago, artisans here carved geometric patterns into ochre, their marks deliberate and repeated, lines crossing, hatching, forming motifs that would not fade with time. These engravings, along with pierced shell beads and bone tools, reveal more than personal adornment. They signal shared meaning, a common language of color and form that stretched beyond any single group. Trade routes traced by archaeologists show obsidian from Anatolia reaching the Levant over 1,000 kilometers away, while shells and amber at Mezhyrich traveled hundreds of kilometers from their origins. Such distances were not crossed by armies, but by travelers and messengers, their journeys linking people who would never meet face to face. Each exchange carried more than raw material. Embedded in these objects were stories, obligations, and a web of trust that bound distant communities together. The value of these networks lay in their stability. When a drought struck or a hunt failed, it was the promise of help from another camp, sometimes a week's walk away, that made the difference between survival and loss. Archaeological sourcing studies show that these connections endured for generations, their roots mapped not by borders, but by memory and shared need. In this networked world, violence threatened more than immediate safety. A raid or theft could sever ties, cutting off access to vital resources and information. The incentive was clear: maintain peace, honor obligations, and keep the lines open. Cooperation wasn't just a choice, it was a lifeline. The artifacts left behind, from ochre tablets to traded blades, speak to a Stone Age economy where generosity and reputation mattered more than conquest. Before property lines and fortified walls, bonds of exchange formed the strongest defense against conflict. Stone walls rose along the edge of the Jordan Valley nearly 10,000 years ago. At Jericho, a tower of stone stood 8.5 meters high, its base anchored by a wall thick enough to withstand more than wind and rain. Building it took 100 workers months of labor, hauling, fitting, stacking, each stone a declaration that this place could not simply be walked away from. Across Anatolia, the houses of Çatalhöyük, pressed tightly together, forming a honeycomb of mud brick. No streets, no gates, just rooftops and ladders. A maze where every home became a barrier. Here, the layout itself slowed any intruder. These settlements did not sprawl. They clustered, dense and inward-facing, signaling a new logic. Instead of mobility, defense now shaped the horizon. The freedom to leave faded, replaced by the need to hold ground. In a quiet field near Talheim, Germany, archaeologists uncovered a pit containing the remains of 34 people, men, women, and children, buried together. Their skulls bore deep cuts and crushing blows from adzes. While some showed arrow wounds, no one was spared. The trauma patterns ran across all ages, with no sign of defensive wounds, suggesting the victims were attacked from behind or while fleeing. At Schletz in Austria, the story was even larger in scale. Excavators found the bones of nearly 200 individuals scattered within a settlement's ditches, most with crushed skulls and broken limbs. Young women were notably absent, hinting at capture or forced removal. Both sites show clear evidence of organized killing, not isolated disputes. The wounds, the mass graves, and the demographic sweep point to a new reality. Violence now targeted entire communities, and war had arrived with the first farmers. Patterns from the Stone Age reveal that the structure of daily life, how people moved, how they shared, how they built, did more to shape conflict than any inherited urge for violence. When groups could walk away from trouble, they did. When networks stretched across landscapes, peace became the practical choice. Even the rare violence at places like Jebel Sahaba, Sahaba, and Nataruk followed environmental bottlenecks and shrinking options, not a universal drive to fight. The arrival of permanent walls and mass graves in the Neolithic signals a turning point. Now, choices narrowed, boundaries hardened, and the possibility for large-scale war grew. Today, the echoes remain. Where systems create choke points over land, water, or resources, conflict often follows. Where connections and flexibility endure, peace finds room to grow. The story of Stone Age warlessness is not just about the past. It is a reminder that the architecture of society, more than temperament, sets the terms for peace or violence. Archaeological evidence shows that at sites like Sima de los Huesos, only a single probable homicide is recorded over 430,000 years ago. In the Paleolithic, trauma cases such as Shanidar III were rare and often survivable, while settlements like Terra Amata and Mezhyrich reveal no fortifications or signs of sustained conflict. When violence did erupt, as at Jebel Sahaba and Nataruk, it was exceptional, often linked to environmental stress. The absence of specialized weapons, warrior classes and permanent borders kept organized warfare at bay for tens of thousands of years. Yet the transition to the Neolithic brought walls at Jericho and mass graves at Talheim, as surplus and sedentary life changed the structure of societies. Questions remain about the full extent of Stone Age conflicts, given gaps in the archaeological record. Still, the evidence is clear. Mobility, cooperation, and flexible networks were the strongest defenses against war. Today's conflicts, often shaped by borders and resources, echo shifts first recorded in the Neolithic. The Stone Age reminds us that how people structure their world matters as much as their tools.